Hey guys, this video is going to be talking about lesson 2 of module 12, which is all about analyzing data. Now, at the beginning of the lesson, there are some vocabulary words that you need to be familiar with, so make sure you look over those before doing this lesson, and if you need to find that information, you can find it on Canvas. What I want to focus on is the back side of this page, which is an example of how to use a two-way table. Now, in this example, it's from a sample of students who were asked if they play an instrument and if they play a sport. Now, before we can find any of the percentages that it's asking at the bottom here, we have to finish the table. So if you notice, there are some blank spaces in here, and we have to fill them in. The gray areas are totals. This side here is a total for the row, and down here are totals for the columns. So the total number of students who play an instrument, I would take the 14 and 37 and add it up to get a total of 51. Now, if I wanted to find the total number of kids who do not play a sport, I would take 37 and 46 and add it to get 83. Now, both of these are subgroups, which is important to know for later. Each of these totals, except for 119, is what we call a subgroup. So it's just a portion of the whole. And the whole is this 119, or the grand total. Now there is one more empty space here that we need to fill in, and it's the number of students who play a sport and not an instrument. So if you notice, there are 36 total students who play a sport, and 14 of them also play an instrument. So to find this empty space, I do 36 minus the 14, which is going to give me 22. And now that my table is filled out, I can use it to answer the questions that follow, okay? So they are chunked into different types of questions that you will see about two-way tables. So the first 4 here are all just talking about one variable. The next 4 are talking about combinations of variables, and the last 4 are going to use the subgroups that I talked about before. So let's start with the first 4. The way that you can tell that you have this type of problem is that it's only asking about one of the variables. And remember, our variables are plays a sport, doesn't play a sport, plays an instrument, doesn't play an instrument. So if you read the sentence, it just says students who play an instrument. So that means out of all of the students that we have, what percentage of them play an instrument? It only asks about one variable, which means I'm talking about the grand total. Out of that grand total, how many of them play an instrument? Well, 51 of them do. That's how many play instruments. So it's 51 out of the 119 that I have. And then you would take your calculator and you would do that division. So I'll show it for the first one, and then after that, I'll just tell you what the answer would be. So 51 divided by 119 is going to be 0.43. So that's the same as 43%, or about 43%. Now, B says students who don't play an instrument. So once again, there's just the one variable, how many students play an instrument. So that's out of the 119. Out of all of the students, how many of them do not play an instrument? Do not play an instrument, there are 68 of them. If I found that percentage, I would get 57%, which makes sense because students who play an instrument and don't play an instrument, when you put them together, you should get 100%. 43 and 57 is 100. All right, students who play a sport. So out of our students, which is 119, how many of them play a sport? 36 of them. So if I found that percentage, it would be about 30% of my students. Similarly, students who don't play a sport. So out of all my students, which is 119, how many of them do not play a sport? 83. And if I wanted to find that percent, I would get about 70%. So that's how you do all the ones that use the grand total. Now we're going to change it up a little bit, and we are going to be focusing on students who do 2 things at once, but it's still going to be out of the grand total. Okay, so we're no longer looking at the subgroup totals, and you'll see what I mean here in a second. So it says students who play an instrument and, that keyword is and, play a sport at the same time. So they're doing both things. So out of all of the students that I have, how many of them play an instrument and play a sport? So you see how the intersection is right here? 14 of them play an instrument and a sport at the same time. So it's 14 out of the 119 students that I have. And if I found that percentage, it would be about 12% of my students. All right, we're gonna do the same thing here for letter F. It says students who play an instrument and don't play a sport at the same time. So once again, out of all the students I have, how many of them play an instrument and don't play a sport? So play an instrument, don't play a sport. That's 37 of my kids. Out of 119 is approximately 31%. Okay, now this time, these two together is not going to be the 100% because there are 4 things going on here, not just 2 types. Okay? All right, letter G, students who play a sport and, so once again, there's that word and, don't play an instrument at the same time. So out of my 119 kids, how many of them play a sport but not an instrument? So play a sport, not an instrument. That's 22 of them. So 22 out of 119 is about 19%. Okay? Students who don't play a sport and don't play an instrument at the same time. So once again, out of 119 students, how many of them don't play a sport and don't play an instrument? So they don't do either one. That's 46 of them. So 46 out of my 119 students is about 39%. And if I added those 4 up, I should get 100% because that's talking about all of the combinations that I have. All right, the last 4 are a little different because we're going to be using those subgroups. It says, of the total students who play an instrument, who also play a sport. So this can be a little bit confusing. So when that word and is not in the sentence, okay, we are not focusing on the total, okay? We have 2 separate variables, but don't have the word and. That means that whatever comes first in the statement is going to be the bottom of my fraction. So it says, of the total students who play an instrument. So out of those kids, how many of them also play a sport? So how many kids do we have that play an instrument? Well, let's go back up here and find that subgroup. Here's play an instrument, 51 of them. So out of those 51 students, how many of them also play a sport? Well, 14 of them do. So it's 14 out of 51, which is approximately 28%. Okay, so we're using subgroups here. All right, so here's the difference. Top 4 only used 1 variable, so it's out of the total. Middle 4 had the word and, so it's again out of the total because I want to know out of all the kids I have, how many of them do both things. This one here, the word and is not present. It says of the students who play an instrument. So it's saying out of those kids, how many of them play a sport? Same thing here. Of the total students who don't play an instrument. Okay, so this again is a subgroup. So out of those kids. So first of all, how many students do I have that don't play an instrument? Well, here's don't play an instrument, and there are 68 of them. So 68 is going to be my denominator. And out of those 68, how many also play a sport? Well, 22. So it's 22 out of 68, which is approximately 32%. All right, of the total students who play a sport, who also play an instrument. So again, we've got subgroups. All right, how many students do we have that play a sport? We have 36 of them. So 36 is my denominator. And out of those students, how many of them also play an instrument? 14. So this time we have 14 out of 36, which is going to give me about 39%. Last one, of the total of students who don't play a sport. So there's my subgroup. How many also play an instrument? All right, so of the students who don't play a sport, so there are 83 students who do not play a sport. So that's my denominator. And out of those 83, there are 37 who play an instrument. So it's 37 out of 83, which is approximately 45%. So that is how we would go about analyzing the data that we have in the what is called a two-way table. So the two ways are instruments versus sports. Okay, and that's it.